Welcome to the People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. This is one of our exciting reading episodes. We will have a regular episode again next week. PGttCM is part of the Dark Myths Collective. We can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, or any place you catch your podcasts. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and Twitter too. PGttCM is brought to you by BunnySlippers.com and FoundItemClothing.com. Look to them for some really cool stuff.
Want to help out PGttCM? Why not donate $1 or $5 to PGttCM you could also donate some money to paypal.me/PGttCM, or you could always become part of our t-shirt club, sticker club on patreon.com/PGttCM. And also, you can go to pgttcm.threadless.com to buy one of our shirts, stickers, whatnot, and yeah, thank you so much for your support. For more information about the story, check out the show notes, or go online and check it out for yourself.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Yearsley. The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. In the Court of the Dragon. O thou who burn'st in heart for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed in turn, how long be crying mercy on them? God, why, who art thou to teach, and he to learn? In the church of St. Barnab, Vespers were over. The clergy left the altar. The little choir boys flocked across the chancel and settled in the stalls. A Suisse in rich uniform marched down the south aisle, sounding his staff at every fourth step on the stone pavement. Behind him came that eloquent preacher and good man, Monseigneur C. My chair was near the chancel rail. I now turned towards the west end of the church. The other people between the altar and the pulpit turned too. There was a little scraping and rustling while the congregation seated itself again. The preacher mounted the pulpit stairs and the organ voluntary ceased. I had always found the organ playing at St. Barnab highly interesting. Learned and scientific it was, too much so for my small knowledge, but expressing a vivid, if cold, intelligence. Moreover, it possessed the French quality of taste. Taste reigned supreme, self-controlled, dignified, and reticent. Today, however, from the first chord, I had felt a change for the worse. A sinister change. During Vespers, it had been chiefly the chancel organ which supported the beautiful choir. But now and again, quite wantonly as it seemed, from the west gallery, where the great organ stands, a heavy hand had struck across the church at the serene peace of those clear voices. It was something more than harsh and dissonant, and it betrayed no lack of skill. As it recurred again and again, it set me thinking of what my architect's books say about the custom in early times to consecrate the choir as soon as it was built, and that the nave, being finished sometimes half a century later, often did not get any blessing at all. I wondered idly if that had been the case at St. Barnab, and whether something not usually supposed to be at home in a Christian church might have entered undetected and taken possession of the west gallery. I had read of such things happening too, but not in works on architecture. Then I remembered that St. Barnab was not much more than 100 years old, and smiled at the incongruous association of medieval superstitions with that cheerful little piece of 18th century rococo. But now Vespers were over, and there should have followed a few quiet chords fit to accompany meditation while we waited for the sermon. Instead of that, the discord at the lower end of the church broke out with the departure of the clergy, as if now nothing could control it. I belong to those children of an older and simpler generation who do not love to seek for psychological subtleties in art, and I have ever refused to find in music anything more than melody and harmony. But I felt that in the labyrinth of sounds now issuing from that instrument, there was something being hunted. Up and down the pedals it chased him, while the manuals blared approval. Poor devil! Whoever he was, there seemed small hope of escape. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Who was doing this? How dare he play like that in the midst of divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one appeared to be in the least disturbed. The placid brows of the kneeling nuns, still turned towards the altar, lost none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadow of their white headdress. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at Monseigneur C. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing an Ave Maria. But now, at last, the preacher had made the sign of the cross, and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far I had not found the rest I had counted on when I entered St. Barnabé that afternoon. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst, and it was an exhausted body and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive, which I had brought to my favourite church for healing. For I had been reading The King in Yellow. The sun ariseth, they gather themselves together and lay them down in their dens. Monseigneur C. delivered his text in a calm voice, glancing quietly over the congregation. My eyes turned, I knew not why, toward the lower end of the church. The organist was coming from behind his pipes, and passing along the gallery on his way out. I saw him disappear by a small door that leads to some stairs which descend directly to the street. He was a slender man, and his face was as white as his coat was black. Good riddance, I thought, with your wicked music. I hope your assistant will play the closing voluntary. With a feeling of relief, with a deep, calm feeling of relief, I turned back to the mild face in the pulpit and settled myself to listen. Here, at last, was the ease of mind I longed for. "My children," said the preacher, "one truth the human soul finds hardest of all to learn, that it has nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it." Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he will reconcile that with the Fathers. "Nothing can really harm the soul," he went on in his coolest, clearest tones, because... But I never heard the rest. My eye left his face, I knew not for what reason, and sought the lower end of the church. The same man was coming out from behind the organ, and was passing along the gallery, the same way. But there had not been time for him to return, and if he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill, and my heart sank, and yet his going and coming were no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite to me, he turned and sent across the church, straight into my eyes, a look of hate, intense and deadly. I have never seen any other like it. Would to God I might never see it again. Then he disappeared by the same door through which I had watched him depart less than 60 seconds before. I sat and tried to collect my thoughts. My first sensation was like that of a very young child badly hurt, when it catches its breath before crying out. To suddenly find myself the object of such hatred was exquisitely painful, and this man was an utter stranger. Why should he hate me so? Me, whom he had never seen before? For the moment, all other sensation was merged in this one pang. Even fear was subordinate to grief, and for that moment I never doubted. But in the next I began to reason, and a sense of the incongruous came to my aid. As I have said, St. Barnabé is a modern church. It is small and well lighted. One sees all over it, almost at a glance. The organ gallery gets a strong white light from a row of long windows in the clerestory, which have not even coloured glass. The pulpit being in the middle of the church, it followed that when I was turned toward it, whatever moved at the west end could not fail to attract my eye. When the organist passed, it was no wonder that I saw him. I had simply miscalculated the interval between his first and his second passing. He had come in that last time by the other side door. As for the look which had so upset me, there had been no such thing, and I was a nervous fool. I looked about. This was a likely place to harbour supernatural horrors. That clear-cut, reasonable face of Monseigneur C., his collected manner, and easy, graceful gestures, were they not just a little discouraging to the notion of a gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head, and almost laughed. That fly-away lady supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in a high wind. At the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft, she would point her gold trumpet at him and puff him out of existence. I laughed to myself over this conceit, which at the time I thought very amusing, and sat and chaffed myself and everything else, from the old harpy outside the railing, who had made me pay 10 centimes for my chair before she would let me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than was my organist with the anemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, Monseigneur C. himself. For all devoutness had fled. I had never yet done such a thing in my life, but now I felt a desire to mock. As for the sermon, I could not hear a word of it, for the jingle in my ears of "The skirts of St. Paul has reached, having preached us those 6 Lent lectures, more unctuous than ever he preached," keeping time to the most fantastic and irreverent thoughts. It was no use to sit there any longer. I must get out of the doors and shake myself free from this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still I rose and left the church. A spring sun was shining on the Rue Saint-Honoré as I ran down the church steps. On one corner stood a barrow full of yellow jonquils, pale violets from the Riviera, dark Russian violets, and white Roman hyacinths in a golden cloud of mimosa. The street was full of Sunday pleasure-seekers. I swung my cane and laughed with the rest. Someone overtook and passed me. He never turned, but there was the same deadly malignity in his white profile that there had been in his eyes. I watched him as long as I could see him. His lithe back expressed the same menace. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear him on some errand connected with my destruction. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to move. There began to dawn in me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I deserved that which he threatened. It reached a long way back, a long, long way back. It had laid dormant all these years. It was there, though, and presently it would rise and confront me. But I would try to escape, and I stumbled, as best I could, into the Rue de Rivoli, across the Place de la Concorde, and onto the quay. I looked with sick eyes upon the sun, shining through the white foam of the fountain, pouring over the backs of the dusky bronze river gods, on the faraway ark, a structure of amethyst mist, on the countless vistas of grey stems and bare branches faintly green. Then I saw him again, coming down one of the chestnut alleys of the Cour de la Reine. I left the riverside, plunging blindly across to the Champs-Élysées, and turned towards the Arc. The setting sun was sending its rays along the green sward of the Rond Point. In the full glow, he sat on a bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger, like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed on the malignant hatred of his face. But he was not looking at me. I crept past and dragged my leaden feet up the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought him nearer to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate, and still I tried to save myself. The last rays of sunset were pouring through the great arc. I passed under it and met him face to face. I had left him far down the Champs-Élysées, and yet he came in with a stream of people who were returning from the Bois de Boulogne. He came so close that he brushed me. His slender frame felt like iron inside its loose black covering. He showed no signs of haste, nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing, the will and the power to work me evil. In anguish, I watched him where he went down the broad, crowded avenue that was all flashing with wheels and the trappings of horses and the helmets of the Garde Républicaine. He was soon lost to sight. Then I turned and fled into the Bois, and far out beyond it, I know not where I went, but after a long while, as it seemed to me, night had fallen, and I found myself sitting at a table before a small café. I had wandered back into the Bois. It was hours now since I had seen him. Physical fatigue and mental suffering had left me no power to think or feel. I was tired, so tired. I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home. But that was a long way off. I live in the Court of the Dragon, a narrow passage that leads from the Rue de Rennes to the Rue du Dragon. It is an impasse, traversable only for foot passengers. Over the entrance on the Rue de Rennes is a balcony, supported by an iron dragon. Within the court, tall old houses rise on either side, and close the ends that give on to the two streets. Huge gates, swung back during the day into the walls of the deep archways, close this court after midnight, and one must enter then by ringing at certain small doors on the side. The sunken pavement collects unsavoury pools. Steep stairways pitch down to doors that open on the court. The ground floors are occupied by shops of second-hand dealers and by ironworkers. All day long the place rings with the clink of hammers and the clang of metal bars. Unsavoury as it is below, there is cheerfulness and comfort and hard, honest work above. 5 flights up are the ateliers of architects and painters, and the hiding places of middle-aged students like myself, who want to live alone. When I first came here to live, I was young, and not alone. I had to walk a while before any conveyance appeared, but at last, when I had almost reached the Arc de Triomphe again, an empty cab came along, and I took it. From the Arc to the Rue de Rennes is a drive of more than half an hour, especially when one is conveyed by a tired cab horse that has been at the mercy of Sunday fete makers. There had been time before I passed under the dragon's wings to meet my enemy over and over again, but I never saw him once, and now refuge was close at hand. Before the wide gateway a small mob of children were playing. Our concierge and his wife walked among them with their black poodle, keeping order. Some couples were waltzing on the sidewalk. I returned their greetings and hurried in. All the inhabitants of the court had trooped out into the street. The place was quite deserted, lighted by a few lanterns hung high up, in which the gas burned dimly. My apartment was at the top of a house, halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street, with only a bit of passageway intervening. I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruinous stairs rose before me, leading up to rest and shelter. Looking back over my right shoulder, I saw him, 10 paces off. He must have entered the court with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly nor swiftly, but straight on to me. And now he was looking at me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the church, they met now again, and I knew that the time had come. Retreating backward down the court, I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance on the Rue du Dragon. His eyes told me that I never should escape. It seemed ages while we were going, I retreating, he advancing, down the court in perfect silence. But at last I felt the shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring through into the street, but the shadow was not that of an archway, it was that of a vault. The great doors on the Rue du Dragon were closed. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me, and at the same instant I read it in his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer. The deep vaults, the huge closed doors, their cold iron clamps were all on his side. The thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows. The point from which it would strike was his infernal eyes. Hopeless, I set my back against the barred doors and defied him. There was a scraping of chairs on the stone floor, and a rustling as the congregation rose. I could hear the Suisse's staff in the south aisle, preceding Monseigneur C. to the sacristy. The kneeling nuns, roused from their devout abstraction, made their reverence and went away. The fashionable lady, my neighbour, rose also, with graceful reserve. As she departed, her glance just flitted over my face in disapproval. Half dead, or so it seemed to me, yet intensely alive to every trifle, I sat among the leisurely moving crowd, then rose too, and went toward the door. I had slept through the sermon. Had I slept through the sermon? I looked up and saw him passing along the gallery to his place. Only his side I saw. The thin, bent arm in its black covering looked like one of those devilish, nameless instruments which lie in the disused torture chambers of medieval castles. But I had escaped him, though his eyes had said I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him the power over me came back out of oblivion, where I had hoped to keep it, for I knew him now. Death and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him. They had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I had recognized him almost from the first. I had never doubted what he was come to do, and now I knew, while my body sat safe in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragon. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. A dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away. The arches, the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and I saw the black stars hanging in the heavens, and the wet winds from the lake of Hali chilled my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond the towers of Carcosa rose behind the moon. Death and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him, had changed him for every other eye but mine, and now I heard his voice, rising, swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance, increasing, poured over me in waves of flame. Then I sank into the depths, and I heard the king in yellow whispering to my soul, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." The Yellow Sign, Part 1. Let the red dawn surmise what we shall do when this blue starlight dies and all is through. There are so many things which are impossible to explain. Why should certain chords in music make me think of the brown and golden tints of autumn foliage? Why should the mass of Sainte Cécile bend my thoughts, wandering among caverns whose walls blaze with ragged masses of virgin silver? What was it in the roar and turmoil of Broadway at 6 o'clock that flashed before my eyes the picture of a still Breton forest, where sunlight filtered through spring foliage, and Sylvia bent half curiously, half tenderly, over a small green lizard, murmuring, "To think that this also is a little ward of God." When I first saw the watchman, his back was toward me. I looked at him indifferently until he went into the church. I paid no more attention to him than I had to any other man who lounged through Washington Square that morning, and when I shut my windows and turned back into my studio, I had forgotten him. Late in the afternoon, the day being warm, I raised the window again and leaned out to get a sniff of air. A man was standing in the courtyard of the church, and I noticed him again, with as little interest as I had that morning. I looked across the square to where the fountain was playing, and then, with my mind filled with vague impressions of trees, asphalt drives, and the moving groups of nursemaids and holiday-makers, I started to walk back to my easel. As I turned, my listless glance included the man below in the churchyard. His face was toward me now, and with a perfectly involuntary movement, I bent to see it. At the same moment, he raised his head and looked at me. Instantly I thought of a coffin worm. Whatever it was about the man that repelled me, I did not know, but the impression of a plump, white grave worm was so intense and nauseating that I must have shown it in my expression, for he turned his puffy face away with a movement which made me think of a disturbed grub in a chestnut. I went back to my easel and motioned the model to resume her pose. After working a while, I was satisfied that I was spoiling what I had done as rapidly as possible, and I took up a palette knife and scraped the colour out again. The flesh tones were sallow and unhealthy, and I did not understand how I could have painted such sickly colour into a study which before that had glowed with healthy tones. I looked at Tessie. She had not changed, and the clear flush of health dyed her neck and cheeks as I frowned. "Is it something I've done?" she said. "No, I've made a mess of this arm, and for the life of me, I can't see how I came to paint such mud as that into the canvas," I replied. "Don't I pose well?" she insisted. "Of course, perfectly." "Then it's not my fault." "No, it's my own." "I am very sorry," she said. I told her she could rest while I applied rag and turpentine to the plague spot on my canvas, and she went off to smoke a cigarette and look over the illustrations in the Courrier Français. I did not know whether it was something in the turpentine or a defect in the canvas, but the more I scrubbed, the more that gangrene seemed to spread. I worked like a beaver to get it out, and yet the disease appeared to creep from limb to limb of the study before me. Alarmed, I strove to arrest it, but now the colour on the breast changed, and the whole figure seemed to absorb the infection as a sponge soaks up water. Vigorously I plied a palette knife, turpentine and scraper, thinking all the time what a séance I should hold with Duval, who had sold me the canvas. But soon I noticed that it was not the canvas which was defective, nor yet the colours of Edward. It must be the turpentine, I thought angrily, or else my eyes have become so blurred and confused by the afternoon light that I can't see straight. I called Tessie, the model. She came and leaned over my chair, blowing rings of smoke into the air. "What have you been doing to it?" she exclaimed. "Nothing," I growled. "It must be this turpentine." "What a horrible colour it is now," she continued. "Do you think my flesh resembles green cheese?" "No, I don't," I said angrily. "Did you ever know me to paint like that before?" "No, indeed." "Well then, it must be the turpentine or something," she admitted. She slipped on a Japanese robe and walked to the window. I scraped and rubbed until I was tired, and finally picked up my brushes and hurled them through the canvas with a forcible expression, the tone alone of which reached Tessie's ears. Nevertheless, she promptly began, "That's it. Swear and act silly and ruin your brushes. You have been 3 weeks on that study, and now look. What's the good of ripping the canvas? What creatures artists are!" I felt about as much ashamed as I usually did after such an outbreak, and I turned the ruined canvas to the wall. Tessie helped me clean my brushes, and then danced away to dress. From the screen, she regaled me with bits of advice concerning whole or partial loss of temper, until, thinking perhaps I had been tormented sufficiently, she came out to implore me to button her waist, where she could not reach it on the shoulder. "Everything went wrong from the time you came back from the window and talked about that horrid-looking man you saw in the churchyard," she announced. "Yes, he probably bewitched the picture," I said, yawning. I looked at my watch. "It's after 6, I know," said Tessie, adjusting her hat before the mirror. "Yes," I replied. "I didn't mean to keep you so long." I leaned out of the window, but recoiled with disgust, for the young man with the pasty face stood below in the churchyard. Tessie saw my gesture of disapproval and leaned from the window. "Is that the man you don't like?" she whispered. I nodded. "I can't see his face, but he does look fat and soft. Some way or other," she continued, turning to look at me. "He reminds me of a dream, an awful dream I once had." "Oh," she mused, looking down at her shapely shoes. "Was it a dream after all?" "How should I know?" I smiled. Tessie smiled in reply. "You were in it," she said, "so perhaps you might know something about it." Tessie, I protested. "Don't you dare flatter by saying that you dream about me." "But I did," she insisted. "Shall I tell you about it?" "Go ahead," I replied, lighting a cigarette. Tessie leaned back on the open windowsill and began very seriously. "One night last winter, I was lying in bed, thinking about nothing at all in particular. I had been posing for you, and I was tired out, yet it seemed impossible for me to sleep. I heard the bells in the city ring 10, 11, and midnight. I must have fallen asleep about midnight, because I don't remember hearing the bells after that. It seemed to me that I had scarcely closed my eyes when I dreamed that something impelled me to go to the window. I rose, and raising the sash, leaned out. 25th Street was deserted, as far as I could see. I began to be afraid. Everything outside seemed so black and uncomfortable. Then the sound of wheels in the distance came to my ears, and it seemed to me as though that was what I must wait for. Very slowly the wheels approached, and finally I could make out a vehicle moving along the street. It came nearer and nearer, and when it passed beneath my window, I saw it was a hearse. Then, as I trembled with fear, the driver turned and looked straight at me. When I awoke, I was standing by the open window, shivering with cold, but the black-plumed hearse and the driver were gone. I dreamed this dream again in March last, and again awoke beside the open window. Last night the dream came again. You remember how it was raining? When I awoke, standing at the open window, my night-dress was soaked. But where did I come into the dream? I asked. You were in the coffin, but you were not dead. In the coffin? Yes. How did you know? Could you see me? No, I only knew you were there. Had you been eating Welsh rarebits or lobster salad? I began, laughing, but the girl interrupted me with a frightened cry. Hello, what's up? I said, as she shrank into the embrasure by the window. The man below in the churchyard. He drove the hearse. Nonsense, I said, but Tessie's eyes were wide with terror. I went to the window and looked out. The man was gone. Come, Tessie, I urged. Don't be foolish. You have posed too long. You are nervous. Do you think I could forget that face? She murmured. 3 times I saw the hearse pass below my window, and every time the driver turned and looked up at me. Oh, his face was so white and soft. It looked dead. It looked as if it had been dead a long time. I induced the girl to sit down and swallow a glass of marsala. Then I sat down beside her and tried to give her some advice. Look here, Tessie, I said. You go to the country for a week or 2, and you'll have no more dreams about hearses. You pose all day, and when night comes your nerves are upset. You can't keep this up. Then again, instead of going to bed when your day's work is done, you run off to picnics at Sulzer's Park, or go to the El Dorado or Coney Island, and when you come down here next morning, you're fagged out. There was no real hearse. There was a soft-shell crab dream. She smiled faintly. What about the man in the churchyard? Oh, he's only an ordinary, unhealthy, everyday creature. As true as my name is Tessie Reardon, I swear to you, Mr. Scott, that the face of the man below in the churchyard is the face of the man who drove the hearse. What of it? I said. It's an honest trade. Then you think I did see the hearse? Oh, I said diplomatically, if you really did, it might not be unlikely that the man below drove it. There is nothing in that. Tessie rose, unrolled her scented handkerchief, and, taking a bit of gum from a knot in the hem, placed it in her mouth. Then, drawing on her gloves, she offered me her hand, with a frank, "Good night, Mr. Scott," and walked out. Part 2. The next morning, Thomas, the bellboy, brought me the Herald and a bit of news. The church next door had been sold. I thanked heaven for it. Not that, being a Catholic, I had any repugnance for the congregation next door, but because my nerves were shattered by a blatant exhorter whose every word echoed through the aisle of the church as if it had been my own rooms, and who insisted on his R's with a nasal persistence which revolted my every instinct. Then, too, there was a fiend in human shape, an organist, who reeled off some of the grand old hymns with an interpretation of his own, and I longed for the blood of a creature who could play the doxology with an amendment of minor chords which one hears only in a quartet of very young undergraduates. I believe the minister was a good man, but when he bellowed, "And the Lord said unto Moses, The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. My wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword," I wondered how many centuries of purgatory it would take to atone for such a sin. "Who bought the property?" I asked Thomas. "Nobody that I knows, sir. They do say the gent what owns this here Hamilton Flats was looking at it. He might be building more studios. I walked to the window. The young man with the unhealthy face stood by the churchyard gate, and at the mere sight of him, the same overwhelming repugnance took possession of me. "By the way, Thomas," I said, "who is that fellow down there?" Thomas sniffed. "That there worm, sir? He's night watchman of the church, sir. He makes me tired of sitting out all night on them steps and looking at you insulting like. I'd have punched his head, sir. Beg pardon, sir." "Go on, Thomas." "One night, coming home with Harry, the other English boy, I sees him a-sitting there on them steps. We had Molly and Jen with us, sir, the two girls on the tray service. And he looks so insulting at us that I up and says, 'What are you looking at, you fat slug?' Beg pardon, sir, but that's how I says, sir. Then he don't say nothing, and I says, 'Come out and I'll punch that pudding head.' Then I opens the gate and goes in, but he don't say nothing, only looks insulting like. Then I hits him one, but ugh! His head was that cold and mushy, it'd sicken you to touch him." "What did he do then?" I asked curiously. "Him? Nothing." "And you, Thomas?" The young fellow flushed with embarrassment and smiled uneasily. "Mr. Scott, sir, I ain't no coward, and I can't make it out at all why I run. I was in the 5th Lancers, sir, bugler, at Tel El Kabir, and was shot by the Wells." "You don't mean to say you ran away?" "Yes, sir, I run." "Why?" "That's just what I want to know, sir. I grabbed Molly and run, and the rest was as frightened as I." "But what were they frightened at?" Thomas refused to answer for a while, but now my curiosity was aroused about the repulsive young man below, and I pressed him. 3 years' sojourn in America had not only modified Thomas's Cockney dialect, but had given him the American's fear of ridicule. "You won't believe me, Mr. Scott, sir?" "Yes, I will." "You'll laugh at me, sir?" "Nonsense." He hesitated. "Well, sir, it's Gord's truth that when I hit him, he grabbed me wrists, sir, and when I twisted his soft, mushy fist, one of his fingers come off in me hand." The utter loathing and horror of Thomas's face must have been reflected in my own, for he added, "It's awful, and now when I see him I just go away. He makes me ill." When Thomas had gone, I went to the window. The man stood beside the church railing with both hands on the gate, but I hastily retreated to my easel again, sickened and horrified, for I saw that the middle finger of his right hand was missing. At 9 o'clock, Tessie appeared and vanished behind the screen with a merry, "Good morning, Mr. Scott." When she had reappeared and taken her pose upon the model stand, I started a new canvas, much to her delight. She remained silent as long as I was on the drawing, but as soon as the scrape of the charcoal ceased, and I took up my fixative, she began to chatter. "Oh, I had such a lovely time last night. We went to Tony Pastor's." "Who are we?" I demanded. "Oh, Maggie, you know, Mr. White's model. And Pinky McCormick. We call her Pinky because she's got that beautiful red hair you artists like so much. And Lizzie Burke." I sent a shower of spray from the fixative over the canvas and said, "Well, go on." "We saw Kelly and Baby Barnes the skirt dancer and all the rest. I made a mash." "Then you have gone back on me, Tessie?" She laughed and shook her head. "He's Lizzie Burke's brother, Ed. He's a perfect gentleman." I felt constrained to give her some parental advice concerning mashing, which she took with a bright smile. "Oh, I can take care of a strange mash," she said, examining her chewing gum. "But Ed is different. Lizzie is my best friend." Then she related how Ed had come back from the stocking mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, to find her and Lizzie grown up, and what an accomplished young man he was, and how he thought nothing of squandering $50 for ice cream and oysters to celebrate his entry as clerk into the woolen department of Macy's. Before she finished, I began to paint, and she resumed the pose, smiling and chattering like a sparrow. By noon, I had the study fairly well rubbed in, and Tessie came to look at it. "That's better," she said. I thought so too, and ate my lunch with a satisfied feeling that all was going well. Tessie spread her lunch on a drawing table opposite me, and we drank our claret from the same bottle, and lighted our cigarettes from the same match. I was very much attached to Tessie. I had watched her shoot up into a slender but exquisitely formed woman from a frail, awkward child. She had posed for me during the last 3 years, and among all my models she was my favourite. It would have troubled me very much indeed had she become tough or fly, as the phrase goes, but I never noticed any deterioration of her manner, and felt at heart that she was all right. She and I never discussed morals at all, and I had no intention of doing so, partly because I had none myself, and partly because I knew she would do what she liked, in spite of me. Still, I did hope she would steer clear of complications, because I wished her well, and then also I had a selfish desire to retain the best model I had. I knew that mashing, as she termed it, had no significance with girls like Tessie, and that such things in America did not resemble in the least the same things in Paris. Yet, having lived with my eyes open, I also knew that somebody would take Tessie away some day, in one manner or another, and though I professed to myself that marriage was nonsense, I sincerely hoped that in this case there would be a priest at the end of the vista. I am a Catholic. When I listen to High Mass, when I sign myself, I feel that everything, including myself, is more cheerful, and when I confess, it does me good. A man who lives as much alone as I do must confess to somebody. Then again, Sylvia was Catholic, and it was reason enough for me. But I was speaking of Tessie, which is very different. Tessie also was Catholic, and much more devout than I. So, taking it all in all, I had little fear for my pretty model, until she should fall in love. But then I knew that fate alone would decide her future for her, and I prayed inwardly that fate would keep her away from men like me, and throw into her path nothing but Ed Burkes and Jimmy McCormicks, bless her sweet face. Tessie sat blowing rings of smoke up to the ceiling, and tinkling the ice in her tumbler. "Do you know that I also had a dream last night?" I observed. "Not about that man," she laughed. "Exactly. A dream similar to yours, only much worse. It was foolish and thoughtless of me to say this, but you know how little tact the average painter has. I must have fallen asleep about 10 o'clock, I continued, and after a while I dreamt that I awoke. So plainly did I hear the midnight bells, the wind in the tree branches, and the whistle of steamers from the bay, that even now I can scarcely believe I was not awake. I seemed to be lying in a box which had a glass cover. Dimly I saw the street lamps as I passed, for I must tell you, Tessie, the box in which I reclined appeared to lie in a cushioned wagon which jolted me over a stony pavement. After a while I became impatient and tried to move, but the box was too narrow. My hands were crossed on my breast, so I could not raise them to help myself. I listened and then tried to call. My voice was gone. I could hear the trample of the horses attached to the wagon, and even the breathing of the driver. Then another sound broke upon my ears, like the raising of a window sash. I managed to turn my head a little, and found I could look not only through the glass cover of my box, but also through the glass panes in the side of the covered vehicle. I saw houses, empty and silent, with neither light or life about any of them, excepting one. In that house, a window was open on the first floor, and a figure, all in white, stood looking down into the street. It was you. Tessie had turned her face away from me, and leaned on the table with her elbow. "I could see your face," I resumed, "and it seemed to me to be very sorrowful. Then we passed on, and turned into a narrow black lane. Presently the horses stopped. I waited and waited, closing my eyes with fear and impatience, but all was silent as the grave. After what seemed to me hours, I began to feel uncomfortable. A sense that someone was close to me made me unclose my eyes. Then I saw the white face of the hearse driver looking at me through the coffin lid. A sob from Tessie interrupted me. She was trembling like a leaf. I saw I had made an ass of myself and attempted to repair the damage. "Why, Tess," I said, "I only told you this to show you what influence your story might have on another person's dreams. You don't suppose I really lay in a coffin, do you? What are you trembling for? Don't you see that your dream and my unreasonable dislike for that inoffensive watchman of the church simply set my brain working as soon as I fell asleep?" She laid her head between her arms and sobbed as if her heart would break. What a precious triple donkey I had made of myself, but I was about to break my record. I went over and put my arm about her. "Tessie, dear, forgive me," I said. "I had no business to frighten you with such nonsense. You're too sensible a girl, too good a Catholic to believe in dreams." Her hand tightened on mine, and her head fell back upon my shoulder, but she still trembled, and I petted her and comforted her. "Come, Tess, open your eyes and smile." Her eyes opened with a slow, languid movement and met mine, but their expression was so queer that I hastened to reassure her again. "It's all humbug, Tessie. You surely are not afraid that any harm will come to you because of that?" "No," she said, but her scarlet lips quivered. "Then what's the matter? Are you afraid?" "Yes, not for myself." "For me, then?" I demanded gaily. "For you," she murmured, in a voice almost inaudible. I care for you." At first I started to laugh, but when I understood her, a shock passed through me, and I sat like one turned to stone. This was the crowning bit of idiocy I had committed. During the moment which elapsed between her reply and my answer, I thought of 1,000 responses to that innocent confession. I could pass it by with a laugh. I could misunderstand her and assure her as to my health. I could simply point out that it was impossible she could love me. But my reply was quicker than my thoughts, and I might think, and think now when it was too late, for I had kissed her on the mouth. That evening I took my usual walk in Washington Park, pondering over the occurrences of the day. I was thoroughly committed. There was no back out now, and I stared the future straight in the face. I was not good, not even scrupulous, but I had no idea of deceiving either myself or Tessie. The one passion of my life lay buried in the sunlit forests of Brittany. Was it buried forever? Hope cried no. For 3 years I had been listening to the voice of hope, and for 3 years I had waited for a footstep on my threshold. Had Sylvia forgotten? No, cried hope. I said that I was no good. That is true, but still I was not exactly a comic opera villain. I had led an easy-going, reckless life, taking what invited me of pleasure, deploring and sometimes bitterly regretting consequences. In one thing alone, except my painting, was I serious, and that was something which lay hidden, if not lost, in the Breton forests. It was too late for me to regret what had occurred during the day. Whatever it had been, pity, a sudden tenderness for sorrow, or the more brutal instinct of gratified vanity, it was all the same now, and unless I wished to bruise an innocent heart, my path lay marked before me. The fire and strength, the depth of passion, of a love which I had never even suspected, with all my imagined experience in the world, left me no alternative but to respond or send her away. Whether because I am so cowardly about giving pain to others, or whether it was that I have little of the gloomy Puritan in me, I do not know, but I shrank from disclaiming responsibility for that thoughtless kiss, and in fact had no time to do so before the gates of her heart opened and the flood poured forth. Others, who habitually do their duty and find a sullen satisfaction in making themselves and everyone else unhappy, might have withstood it. I did not. I dared not. After the storm had abated, I did tell her that she might better have loved Ed Burke and worn a plain gold ring, but she would not hear of it, and I thought perhaps, as long as she had decided to love somebody she could not marry, it had better be me. I at least could treat her with an intelligent affection, and whenever she became tired of her infatuation, she could go none the worse for it. For I was decided on that point, although I knew how hard it would be. I remembered the usual termination of platonic liaisons, and I thought how disgusted I had been whenever I heard of one. I knew I was undertaking a great deal for so unscrupulous a man as I was, and I dreamed the future, but never for one moment did I doubt that she was safe with me. Had it been anybody but Tessie, I should not have bothered my head about scruples, for it did not occur to me to sacrifice Tessie as I would have sacrificed a woman of the world. I looked the future squarely in the face, and saw the several probable endings to the affair. She would either tire of the whole thing, or become so unhappy that I should have either to marry her or go away. If I married her, we would be unhappy, I with a wife unsuited to me, and she with a husband unsuitable for any woman. For my past life could scarcely entitle me to marry. If I went away, she might either fall ill, recover, and marry some Eddie Burke, or she might recklessly or deliberately go and do something foolish. On the other hand, if she tired of me, then her whole life would be before her, with beautiful vistas of Eddie Burkes and marriage rings, and twins, and Harlem flats, and heaven knows what. As I strolled along through the trees by the Washington Arch, I decided that she should find a substantial friend in me anyway, and the future could take care of itself. Then I went into the house and put on my evening dress, for the little, faintly perfumed note on my dresser said, "Have a cab at the stage door at 11, and the note was signed Edith Carmichael, Metropolitan Theatre. I took supper that night, or rather we took supper, Miss Carmichael and I, at Solari's, and the dawn was just beginning to gild the cross on the Memorial Church as I entered Washington Square after leaving Edith at the Brunswick. There was not a soul in the park as I passed along the trees and took the walk which leads from the Garibaldi statue to the Hamilton apartment house. But as I passed the churchyard, I saw a figure sitting on the stone steps. In spite of myself, a chill crept over me at the sight of the white, puffy face, and I hastened to pass. Then he said something which might have been addressed to me, or might merely have been a mutter to himself. But a sudden furious anger flamed up within me that such a creature should address me. For an instant I felt like wheeling about and smashing my stick over his head. But I walked on, and entering the Hamilton went to my apartment. For some time I tossed about the bed, trying to get the sound of his voice out of my ears, but could not. It filled my head, that muttering sound, like thick, oily smoke from a fat-rendering vat, or an odour of noisome decay. And as I lay and tossed about, the voice in my ears seemed more distinct, and I began to understand the words he had muttered. They came to me slowly, as if I had forgotten them, and at last I could make some sense out of the sounds. It was this: "Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign?" I was furious. What did he mean by that? Then, with a curse upon him and his, I rolled over and went to sleep. But when I awoke later, I looked pale and haggard, for I had dreamed the dream of the night before, and it troubled me more than I cared to think. I dressed and went down into my studio. Tessie sat by the window, but as I came in, she rose and put both arms around my neck for an innocent kiss. She looked so sweet and dainty that I kissed her again, and then sat down before the easel. "Hello, where's the study I began yesterday?" I asked. Tessie looked conscious but did not answer. I began to hunt among the piles of canvases, saying, "Hurry up, Tess, and get ready. We must take advantage of the morning light." When at last I gave up the search among the other canvases and turned to look around the room for the missing study, I noticed Tessie standing by the screen with her clothes still on. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Don't you feel well?" "Yes." "Then hurry. Do you want me to pose as I have always posed?" Then I understood. Here was a new complication. I had lost, of course, the best nude model I had ever seen. I looked at Tessie. Her face was scarlet. Alas, alas, we had eaten of the tree of knowledge, and Eden and native innocence were dreams of the past. I mean, for her. I suppose she noticed the disappointment on my face, for she said, I will pose if you wish. The study is behind the screen here where I put it." "No," I said. "We will begin something new." And I went into my wardrobe and picked out a Moorish costume, which fairly blazed with tinsel. It was a genuine costume, and Tessie retired to the screen with it, enchanted. When she came forth again, I was astonished. Her long black hair was bound above her forehead with a circlet of turquoises, and the ends curled about her glittering girdle. Her feet were encased in the embroidered pointed slippers, and the skirt of her costume, curiously wrought with arabesques in silver, fell to her ankles. The deep metallic blue vest, embroidered with silver, and the short Mooresque jacket, spangled and sewn with turquoises, became her wonderfully. She came up to me and held up her face, smiling. I slipped my hand into my pocket, and, drawing out a gold chain with a cross attached, dropped it over her head. "It's yours, Tessie." "Mine?" she faltered. "Yours. Now, go and pose." Then, with a radiant smile, she ran behind the screen and presently reappeared with a little box on which was written my name. "I had intended to give it to you when I went home tonight," she said, "but I can't wait now." I opened the box. On the pink cotton inside lay a clasp of black onyx, on which was inlaid a curious symbol or letter in gold. It was neither Arabic nor Chinese, nor, as I found afterwards, did it belong to any human script. "It's all I had to give you for a keepsake," she said timidly. I was annoyed, but I told her how much I should prize it, and promised to wear it always. She fastened it on my coat beneath the lapel. "How foolish, Tess, to go and buy me such a beautiful thing as this," I said. "I did not buy it," she laughed. "Where did you get it?" Then she told me how she had found it one day, while coming from the aquarium in the Battery, how she had advertised it and watched the papers, but at last gave up all hopes of finding the owner. "That was last winter," she said, "the very day I had the first horrid dream about the hearse." I remembered my dream of the previous night, but said nothing, and presently my charcoal was flying over a new canvas, and Tessie stood motionless on the model stand. Part 3. The day following was a disastrous one for me. While moving a framed canvas from one easel to another, my foot slipped on the polished floor and I fell heavily on both wrists. They were so badly sprained that it was useless to attempt to hold a brush, and I was obliged to wander about the studio, glaring at unfinished drawings and sketches, until despair seized me and I sat down to smoke and twiddle my thumbs with rage. The rain blew against the windows and rattled on the roof of the church, driving me into a nervous fit with its interminable patter. Tessie sat sewing by the window, and every now and then raised her head and looked at me with such innocent compassion that I began to feel ashamed of my irritation, and looked about for something to occupy me. I had read all the papers and all the books in the library, but for the sake of something to do, I went to the bookcases and shoved them open with my elbow. I knew every volume by its colour, and examined them all, passing slowly around the library, and whistling to keep up my spirits. I was turning to go into the dining room when my eye fell upon a book bound in serpent skin, standing in a corner of the top shelf of the last bookcase. I did not remember it, and from the floor could not decipher the pale lettering on the back, so I went to the smoking room and called Tessie. She came in from the studio and climbed up to reach the book. "What is it?" I asked. "The King in Yellow." I was dumbfounded. Who had placed it there? How came it into my rooms? I had long ago decided that I should never open that book, and nothing on earth could have persuaded me to buy it. Fearful lest curiosity might tempt me to open it, I had never even looked at it in bookstores. If I ever had any curiosity to read it, the awful tragedy of young Castaigne, whom I knew, prevented me from exploring its wicked pages. I had always refused to listen to any description of it, and indeed nobody ever ventured to discuss the second part aloud, so I had absolutely no knowledge of what those leaves might reveal. I stared at the poisonous, mottled binding as I would at a snake. "Don't touch it, Tessie," I said. "Come down." Of course, my admonition was enough to arouse her curiosity, and before I could prevent it, she took the book and, laughing, danced off into the studio with it. I called to her, but she slipped away with a tormenting smile at my helpless hands, and I followed her with some impatience. "Tessie," I cried, entering the library, "listen, I'm serious. Put that book away. I do not wish you to open it." The library was empty. I went into both drawing rooms, then into the bedrooms, laundry, kitchen, and finally returned to the library, and began a systematic search. She had hidden herself so well that it was half an hour later when I discovered her, crouching, white and silent, by the latticed window in the storeroom above. At the first glance, I saw she had been punished for her foolishness. The King in Yellow lay at her feet, but the book was open at the second part. I looked at Tessie and saw it was too late. She had opened The King in Yellow. Then I took her by the hand and led her into the studio. She seemed dazed, and when I told her to lie down on the sofa, she obeyed me without a word. After a while, she closed her eyes, and her breathing became regular and deep, but I could not determine whether or not she slept. For a long while, I sat silently beside her, but she neither stirred nor spoke, and at last I rose, and, entering the unused storeroom, took the book in my least injured hand. It seemed heavy as lead, but I carried it into the studio again, and, sitting down on the rug beside the sofa, opened it, and read it through from beginning to end. When, faint with excess of my emotions, I dropped the volume and leaned wearily back against the sofa, Tessie opened her eyes and looked at me. We had been speaking for some time in a dull, monotonous strain before I realized that we were discussing The King in Yellow. Oh, the sin of writing such words, words which are clear as crystal, limpid and musical as bubbling springs, words which sparkle and glow like the poisoned diamonds of the Medicis. Oh, the wickedness, the hopeless damnation of a soul who could fascinate and paralyze human creatures with such words. Words understood by the ignorant and wise alike, words which are more precious than jewels, more soothing than music, more awful than death. We talked on, unmindful of the gathering shadows, and she was begging me to throw away the clasp of black onyx, quaintly inlaid with what we now knew to be the yellow sign. I never shall know why I refused, though even at this hour, here in my bedroom as I write this confession, I should be glad to know what it was that prevented me from tearing the yellow sign from my breast and casting it into the fire. I am sure I wished to do so, and yet Tessie pleaded with me in vain. Night fell, and the hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the king and the pallid mask, and midnight sounded from the misty spires in the fog-wrapped city. We spoke of Hastur and of Casilda, while outside the fog rolled against the blank window panes, as the cloud waves roll and break on the shores of Harley. The house was very silent now, and not a sound came up from the misty streets. Tessie lay among the cushions, her face a grey blot in the gloom, but her hands were clasped in mine, and I knew that she knew and read my thoughts as I read hers, for we had understood the mystery of the Hyades, and the phantom of truth was laid. Then, as we answered each other, swiftly, silently, thought on thought, the shadows stirred in the gloom about us, and far in the distant streets we heard a sound. Nearer and nearer it came, the dull crunching of wheels, nearer and yet nearer. And now, outside before the door, it ceased, and I dragged myself to the window and saw a black plumed hearse. The gate below opened and shut, and I crept shaking to my door and bolted it, but I knew no bolts, no locks could keep that creature out who was coming for the yellow sign. And now I heard him moving very softly along the hall. Now he was at the door, and the bolts rotted at his touch. Now he had entered. With eyes starting from my head, I peered into the darkness, but when he came into the room, I did not see him. It was only when I felt him envelop me in his cold, soft grasp that I cried out and struggled with deadly fury, but my hands were useless, and he tore the onyx clasp from my coat and struck me full in the face. Then, as I fell, I heard Tessie's soft cry, and her spirit fled, and even while falling, I longed to follow her, for I knew that the king in yellow had opened his tattered mantle, and there was only God to cry to now. I could tell more, but I cannot see what help it will be to the world. As for me, I am past human help or hope. As I lie here, writing, careless even whether or not I die before I finish, I can see the doctor gathering up his powders and phials with a vague gesture to the good priest beside me, which I understand. They will be very curious to know the tragedy, they of the outside world, who write books and print millions of newspapers. But I shall write no more, and the Father Confessor will seal my last words with the seal of sanctity when his holy office is done. They of the outside world may send their creatures into wrecked homes and death-smitten firesides, and their newspapers will batten on blood and tears. But with me, their spies must halt before the confessional. They know that Tessie is dead, and that I am dying. They know how the people in the house, aroused by an infernal scream, rushed into my room and found one living and two dead. But they do not know what I shall tell them now. They do not know that the doctor said, as he pointed to a horrible, decomposed heap on the floor, the livid corpse of the watchman from the church. I have no theory, no explanation. That man must have been dead for months. I think I am dying. I wish the priest would... The Demoiselle 10. Mais je crois que je suis descendu en puits, ténébreux en quel dissoit, Heraclitas est verret caché. There be 3 things which are too wonderful for me, yea, 4 which I know not. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent upon a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. Part 1. The utter desolation of the scene began to have its effect. I sat down to face the situation and if possible recall to mind some landmark which might aid me in extricating myself from my present position. If I could only find the ocean again, all would be clear, for I knew one could see the island of Groix from the cliffs. I laid down my gun, and kneeling behind a rock, lighted a pipe. Then I looked at my watch. It was nearly 4 o'clock. I might have wandered far from Kerselec since daybreak. Standing the day before on the cliffs below Kerselec with Goulvin, looking out over the sombre moors among which I had now lost my way, these downs had appeared to me level as a meadow, stretching to the horizon, and although I knew how deceptive is distance, I could not realize that what from Kerselec seemed to be mere grassy hollows were great valleys covered with gorse and heather, and what looked like scattered boulders were in reality enormous cliffs of granite. "It's a bad place for a stranger," old Goulvin had said. "You'd better take a guide." And I had replied, "I shall not lose myself." Now I knew that I had lost myself, as I sat there smoking, with the sea wind blowing in my face. On every side stretched the moorland, covered with flowering gorse and heath and granite boulders. There was not a tree in sight, much less a house. After a while I picked up the gun and, turning my back on the sun, tramped on again. There was little use in following any of the brawling streams which every now and then crossed my path, for instead of flowing into the sea, they ran inland to reedy pools in the hollows of the moors. I had followed several, but they all led me to swamps or silent little ponds, from which the snipe rose peeping and wheeled away in an ecstasy of fright. I began to feel fatigued, and the gun galled my shoulder in spite of the double pads. The sun sank lower and lower, shining level across yellow gorse and the moorland pools. As I walked, my own gigantic shadow led me on, seeming to lengthen at every step. The gorse scraped against my leggings, crackled beneath my feet, showering the brown earth with blossoms, and the brake bowed and billowed along my path. From tufts of heath, rabbits scurried away through the bracken, and among the swamp grass I heard the wild duck's drowsy quack. Once a fox stole across my path, and again, as I stooped to drink at a hurrying rill, a heron flapped heavily from the reeds beside me. I turned to look at the sun. It seemed to touch the edges of the plain. When at last I decided that it was useless to go on, and that I must make up my mind to spend at least one night on the moors, I threw myself down, thoroughly fagged out. The evening sunlight slanted warm across my body, but the sea winds began to rise, and I felt a chill strike through me from my wet shooting boots. High overhead, gulls were wheeling and tossing like bits of white paper. From some distant marsh, a solitary curlew called. Little by little, the sun sank into the plain, and the zenith flushed with the afterglow. I watched the sky change from palest gold to pink, and then to smouldering fire. Clouds of midges danced above me, and high in the calm air a bat dipped and soared. My eyelids began to droop. Then, as I shook off the drowsiness, a sudden crash among the bracken roused me. I raised my eyes. A great bird hung, quivering in the air above my face. For an instant I stared, incapable of motion. Then something leapt past me in the ferns, and the bird rose, wheeled, and pitched headlong into the brake. I was on my feet in an instant, peering through the gorse. There came the sound of a struggle from a bunch of heather close by, and then all was quiet. I stepped forward, my gun poised, but when I came to the heather, the gun fell under my arm again, and I stood motionless in silent astonishment. A dead hare lay on the ground, and on the hare stood a magnificent falcon, one talon buried in the creature's neck, the other planted firmly on its limp flank. But what astonished me was not the mere sight of a falcon sitting upon its prey. I had seen that more than once. It was that the falcon was fitted with a sort of leash about both talons, and from the leash hung a round bit of metal like a sleigh bell. The bird turned its fierce yellow eyes on me, and then stooped and struck its yellow beak into the quarry. At the same instant, hurried steps sounded among the heather, and a girl sprang into the covert in front. Without a glance at me, she walked up to the falcon, and passing her gloved hand under its breast, raised it from the quarry. Then she deftly slipped a small hood over the bird's head, and holding it out on her gauntlet, stooped and picked up the hair. She passed a cord around the animal's legs, and fastened the end of the thong to her girdle. Then she started to retrace her steps through the covert. As she passed me, I raised my cap, and she acknowledged my presence with a scarcely perceptible inclination. I had been so astonished, so lost in admiration of the scene before my eyes, that it had not occurred to me that here was my salvation. But as she moved away, I recollected that, unless I wanted to sleep on a windy moor that night, I had better recover my speech without delay. At my first word, she hesitated, and as I stepped before her, I thought a look of fear came into her beautiful eyes. But as I humbly explained my unpleasant plight, her face flushed, and she looked at me in wonder. "Surely you do not come from Kerselec," she repeated. Her sweet voice had no trace of the Breton accent, nor of any accent which I knew, and yet there was something in it I seemed to have heard before, something quaint and indefinable, like the theme of an old song. I explained that I was an American, unacquainted with Finisterre, shooting there for my own amusement. "An American?" she repeated, in the same quaint musical tones. "I have never before seen an American." For a moment she stood silent. Then looking at me, she said, "If you should walk all night, you could not reach Kerselec now, even if you had a guide." This was pleasant news. "But," I began, "if I could only find a peasant's hut where I might get something to eat and shelter." The falcon on her wrist fluttered and shook its head. The girl smoothed its glossy back and glanced at me. "Look around," she said gently. "Can you see the end of these moors? Look, north, south, east, west. Can you see anything but moorland and bracken?" "No," I said. "The moor is wild and desolate. It is easy to enter, but sometimes they who enter never leave it. There are no peasants' huts here." "Well," I said, "if you will tell me in which direction Kerselec lies, tomorrow it will take me no longer to go back than it has to come." She looked at me again with an expression almost like pity. "Ah," she said, "to come is easy and takes hours. To go is different and may take centuries." I stared at her in amazement, but decided that I had misunderstood her. Then, before I had time to speak, she drew a whistle from her belt and sounded it. "Sit down and rest," she said to me. "You have come a long distance and are tired." She gathered up her pleated skirts and, motioning me to follow, picked her dainty way through the gorse to a flat rock among the ferns. "They will be here directly," she said, and taking a seat at one end of the rock, invited me to sit down on the other edge. The afterglow was beginning to fade in the sky, and a single star twinkled faintly through the rosy haze. A long wavering triangle of waterfowl drifted southward over our heads, and from the swamps around plover were calling. "They are very beautiful, these moors," she said quietly. "Beautiful, but cruel to strangers," I answered. "Beautiful and cruel," she repeated dreamily. "Beautiful and cruel." "Like a woman," I said stupidly. "Oh!" she cried, with a little catch in her breath, and looked at me. Her dark eyes met mine, and I thought she seemed angry or frightened. "Like a woman," she repeated under her breath. "How cruel to say so." Then, after a pause, as though speaking aloud to herself, "How cruel for him to say that." I don't know what sort of apology I offered for my inane though harmless speech, but I know that she seemed so troubled about it that I began to think I had said something very dreadful without knowing it, and remembered with horror the pitfalls and snares which the French language sets for foreigners. While I was trying to imagine what I might have said, a sound of voices came across the moor, and the girl rose to her feet. "No," she said, with a trace of a smile on her pale face. "I will not accept your apologies, monsieur, but I must prove you wrong, and that shall be my revenge. Look, here come Hastur and Raoul." Two men loomed up in the twilight. One had a sack across his shoulders, and the other carried a hoop before him, as a waiter carries a tray. The hoop was fastened with straps to his shoulders, and around the edge of the circlet sat 3 hooded falcons, fitted with tinkling bells. The girl stepped up to the falconer, and with a quick turn of her wrist, transferred her falcon to the hoop, where it quickly sidled off and nestled among its mates, who shook their hooded heads and ruffled their feathers till the belled jesses tinkled again. The other man stepped forward, and bowing respectfully, took up the hare and dropped it into the game sack. "These are my piqueurs," said the girl, turning to me with a gentle dignity. "Raoul is a good falconier, and I shall some day make him a grand veneur. Hastur is incomparable." The 2 silent men saluted me respectfully. "Did I not tell you, monsieur, that I should prove you wrong?" she continued. "This, then, is my revenge, that you do me the courtesy of accepting food and shelter at my own house." Before I could answer, she spoke to the falconers, who started instantly across the heath, and with a gracious gesture to me she followed. I don't know whether I made her understand how profoundly grateful I felt, but she seemed pleased to listen as we walked over the dewy heather. "Are you not very tired?" she asked. I had clean forgotten my fatigue in her presence, and I told her so. "Don't you think your gallantry is a little old-fashioned?" she said, and when I looked confused and humbled, she added quietly, "Oh, I like it. I like everything old-fashioned, and it is delightful to hear you say such pretty things." The moorland around us was very still now under its ghostly sheet of mist. The plovers had ceased their calling. The crickets and all the little creatures of the fields were silent as we passed, yet it seemed to me as if I could hear them beginning again, far behind us. Well in advance, the 2 tall falconers strode across the heather, and the faint jingling of the hawk's bells came to our ears in distant murmuring chimes. Suddenly a splendid hound dashed out of the mist in front, followed by another and another, until 6 or more were bounding and leaping around the girl beside me. She caressed and quieted them with her gloved hand, speaking to them in quaint terms which I remembered to have seen in old French manuscripts. Then the falcons on the circlet borne by the falconer ahead began to beat their wings and scream, and from somewhere out of sight the notes of a hunting horn floated across the moor. The hounds sprang away before us and vanished in the twilight. The falcons flapped and squealed upon their perch, and the girl, taking up the song of the horn, began to hum. Clear and mellow her voice sounded in the night air. Chasseur, chasseur, chassez encore. Quittez Rosette et Jonathan. Ton, 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 ton. Ou pour abattre de l'aurore, que les amours soient de planton. Ton, 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 ten, ton, ton. As I listened to her lovely voice, a grey mass which rapidly grew more distinct loomed up in front, and the horn rang out joyously through the tumult of the hounds and falcons. A torch glimmered at a gate. A light streamed through an opening door, and we stepped upon a wooden bridge which trembled under our feet, and rose, creaking and straining behind us as we passed over the moat, and into a small stone court, walled on every side. From an open doorway a man came, and, bending in salutation, presented a cup to the girl beside me. She took the cup and touched it with her lips, then lowering it, turned to me and said in a low voice, "I bid you welcome." At that moment one of the falconers came with another cup, but before handing it to me, presented it to the girl, who tasted it. The falconer made a gesture to receive it, but she hesitated a moment, and then, stepping forward, offered me the cup with her own hands. I felt this to be an act of extraordinary graciousness, but hardly knew what was expected of me, and did not raise it to my lips at once. The girl flushed crimson. I saw that I must act quickly. "Mademoiselle," I faltered, "a stranger whom you have saved from dangers he may never realize, empties this cup to the gentlest and loveliest hostess of France." "In his name," she murmured, crossing herself as I drained the cup. Then, stepping into the doorway, she turned to me with a pretty gesture, and taking my hand in hers, led me into the house, saying again and again, "You are very welcome. Indeed, you are welcome to the Chateau d'Is." Part 2. I awoke next morning with the music of the horn in my ears, and leaping out of the ancient bed, went to a curtained window where the sunlight filtered through little deep-set panes. The horn ceased as I looked into the court below. A man who might have been brother to the two falconers of the night before stood in the midst of a pack of hounds. A curved horn was strapped over his back, and in his hand he held a long-lashed whip. The dogs whined and yelped, dancing around him in anticipation. There was the stamp of horses, too, in the walled yard. "Mount!" cried a voice in Breton, and with a clatter of hoofs, the two falconers with falcons upon their wrists rode into the courtyard among the hounds. Then I heard another voice which sent the blood throbbing through my heart. "Piriou Louis, hunt the hounds well, and spare neither spur nor whip. Thou, Raoul, and thou, Gaston, see that the épervier does not prove himself niais, and if it be best in your judgment, faites courtoisie à l'oiseau. Jardinier, an oiseau, like the muet there on Hastur's wrist, is not difficult, but thou, Raoul, mayst not find it so simple to govern that hagard. Twice last week he foamed au vif, and lost the beccade, although he is used to the lure. The bird acts like a stupid branchier. Paître un hagard n'est pas si facile." Was I dreaming? The old language of falconry, which I had read in yellow manuscripts, the old forgotten French of the Middle Ages, was sounding in my ears, while the hounds bayed and the hawks' bells tinkled accompaniment to the stamping horses. She spoke again in the sweet, forgotten language. "If you would rather attach the longe and leave the hagard au bloc, Raoul, I shall say nothing, for it were a pity to spoil so fair a day's sport with an ill-trained sort. Laissez-moi abaisser. It is possibly the best way. Ça lui donnera des rênes. I was perhaps hasty with the bird. It takes time to pass à la filière, and the exercise is discret." Then the falconer, Raoul, bowed in his stirrups, and replied, "If it be the pleasure of Mademoiselle, I shall keep the hawk." "It is my wish," she answered. "Falconry I know, but you have yet to give me many a lesson in hauteur-serrerie, my poor Raoul. Sieur Piriou Louis, mount!" The huntsman sprang into an archway, and in an instant returned, mounted upon a strong black horse, followed by a piqueur, also mounted. "Ah!" she cried joyously. "Speed, Clemarac Reine! Speed, speed all! Sound thy horn, Sieur Piriou!" The silvery music of the hunting horn filled the courtyard. The hounds sprang through the gateway, and galloping hoofbeats plunged out of the paved court, loud on the drawbridge, suddenly muffled, then lost in the heather and bracken of the moors. Distant and more distant sounded the horn, until it became so faint that the sudden carol of a soaring lark drowned it in my ears. I heard the voice below responding to some call from within the house. I do not regret the chase. I will go another time. Courtesy to the stranger, Pelagie, remember. And a feeble voice came quavering from within the house. Courtoisie. I stripped and rubbed myself from head to foot in the huge earthen basin of icy water which stood upon the stone floor at the foot of my bed. Then I looked about for my clothes. They were gone, but on a settle near the door lay a heap of garments which I inspected with astonishment. As my clothes had vanished, I was compelled to attire myself in the costume which had evidently been placed there for me to wear while my own clothes dried. Everything was there, cap, shoes, and hunting doublet of silvery grey homespun, but the close-fitting costume and seamless shoes belonged to another century, and I remembered the strange costumes of the three falconers in the courtyard. I was sure that it was not the modern dress of any portion of France or Brittany, but not until I was dressed and stood before a mirror between the windows did I realize that I was clothed much more like a young huntsman of the Middle Ages than like a Breton of that day. I hesitated and picked up the cap. Should I go down and present myself in that strange guise? There seemed to be no help for it. My own clothes were gone, and there was no bell in the ancient chamber to call a servant. So I contented myself with removing a short hawk's feather from the cap, and, opening the door, went downstairs. By the fireplace in the large room at the foot of the stairs, an old Breton woman sat spinning with a distaff. She looked up at me when I appeared, and smiling frankly wished me health in the Breton language, to which I laughingly replied in French. At the same moment my hostess appeared, and returned my salutation with a grace and dignity that sent a thrill to my heart. Her lovely head, with its dark curly hair, was crowned with a headdress which set all doubts as to the epoch of my own costume at rest. Her slender figure was exquisitely set off in the homespun hunting gown edged with silver, and on her gauntlet-covered wrist she bore one of her petted hawks. With perfect simplicity she took my hand and led me into the garden in the court, and seating herself before a table, invited me very sweetly to sit beside her. Then she asked me, in her soft, quaint accent, how I had passed the night, and whether I was very much inconvenienced by wearing the clothes which old Pelagie had put there for me while I slept. I looked at my own clothes and shoes, drying in the sun by the garden wall, and hated them. What horrors they were compared with the graceful costume which I now wore. I told her this, laughing, but she agreed with me very seriously. "We will throw them away," she said in a quiet voice. In my astonishment, I attempted to explain that I not only could not think of accepting clothes from anybody, although for all I knew it might be the custom of hospitality in that part of the country, but that I should cut an impossible figure if I returned to France clothed as I was then. She laughed and tossed her pretty head, saying something in old French which I did not understand, and then Pelagie trotted out with a tray on which stood 2 bowls of milk, a loaf of white bread, fruit, a platter of honeycomb, and a flagon of deep red wine. "You see, I have not yet broken my fast, because I wished you to eat with me. But I am very hungry," she smiled. "I would rather die than forget one word of what you have said," I blurted out, while my cheeks burned. "She will think me mad," I added to myself, but she turned to me with sparkling eyes. "Ah," she murmured, "then monsieur knows all there is of chivalry." She crossed herself and broke bread. I sat and watched her white hands, not daring to raise my eyes to hers. "Will you not eat?" she asked. "Why do you look so troubled?" Ah, why? I knew it now. I knew I would give my life to touch with my lips those rosy palms. I understood now that from the moment when I looked into her dark eyes, there on the moor last night, I had loved her. My great and sudden passion held me speechless. "Are you ill at ease?" she asked again. Then, like a man who pronounces his own doom, I answered in a low voice, "Yes, I am ill at ease for love of you." and as she did not stir nor answer, the same power moved my lips in spite of me, and I said, I, who am unworthy of the lightest of your thoughts, I who abuse hospitality and repay your gentle courtesy with bold presumption, I love you. She leaned her head upon her hands and answered softly, I love you. Your words are very dear to me. I love you. Then I shall win you. Win me, she replied. But all the time I had been sitting silent, my face turned toward her. She, also silent, her sweet face resting on her upturned palm, sat facing me, and as her eyes looked into mine, I knew that neither she nor I had spoken human speech, but I knew that her soul had answered mine, and I drew myself up, feeling youth and joyous love coursing through every vein. She, with a bright colour in her lovely face, seemed as one awakened from a dream, and her eyes sought mine with a questioning glance which made me tremble with delight. We broke our fast, speaking of ourselves. I told her my name, and she told me hers, the Demoiselle Jeanne d'Ys. She spoke of her father and mother's death, and how the 19 of her years had been passed in the little fortified farm, alone with her nurse Pelagie, Glemarec Reine, the piqueur, and the 4 falconers, Raoul, Gaston, Hastur, and the Sieur Piriou Louis, who had served her father. She had never been outside the moorland, never even had seen a human soul before, except the falconers and Pelagie. She did not know how she had heard of Kerselec. Perhaps the falconers had spoken of it. She knew the legends of Loup Garou and Jeanne la Flamme from her nurse Pelagie. She embroidered and spun flax. Her hawks and hounds were her only distraction. When she had met me there on the moor, she had been so frightened that she almost dropped at the sound of my voice. She had, it was true, seen ships at sea from the cliffs, but as far as the eye could reach, the moors over which she galloped were destitute of any sign of human life. There was a legend which old Pelagie told, how anybody once lost in the unexplored moorland might never return, because the moors were enchanted. She did not know whether it was true. She never had thought about it until she met me. She did not know whether the falconers had even been outside, or whether they could go if they would. The books in the house, which Pelagie the nurse had taught her to read, were hundreds of years old. All this she told me with a sweet seriousness seldom seen in anyone but children. My own name she found easy to pronounce, and insisted, because my first name was Philip, I must have French blood in me. She did not seem curious to learn anything about the outside world, and I thought perhaps she considered it had forfeited her interest and respect from the stories of her nurse. We were still sitting at the table, and she was throwing grapes to the small field birds which came fearlessly to our very feet. I began to speak in a vague way of going, but she would not hear of it, and before I knew it, I had promised to stay a week and hunt with hawk and hound in their company. I also obtained permission to come again from Kerselec and visit her after my return. Why, she said innocently, I do not know what I should do if you never came back. And I, knowing that I had no right to awaken her with the sudden shock which the avowal of my own love would bring to her, sat silent, hardly daring to breathe. You will come very often? She asked. Very often, I said. Every day? Every day. Oh, she sighed, I am very happy. Come and see my hawks. She rose and took my hand again with a childlike innocence of possession, and we walked through the garden and fruit trees to a grassy lawn, which was bordered by a brook. Over the lawn were scattered 15 or 20 stumps of trees, partially embedded in the grass, and upon all of these, except 2, sat falcons. They were attached to the stumps by thongs which were in turn fastened with steel rivets to their legs, just above the talons. A little stream of pure spring water flowed in a winding course within easy distance of each perch. The birds set up a clamour when the girl appeared, but she went from one to another, caressing some, taking others for an instant upon her wrist, or stooping to adjust their jesses. "Are they not pretty?" she said. "See, here is a falcon gentil. We call it ignoble, because it takes the quarry in direct chase. This is a blue falcon. In falconry we call it noble, because it rises over the quarry, and wheeling drops upon it from above. This white bird is a gerfalcon from the north. It is also noble. Here is a merlin, and this tiercelet is a falcon herna." I asked her how she had learned the old language of falconry. She did not remember, but thought her father must have taught it to her when she was very young. Then she led me away and showed me the young falcons still in the nest. "They are termed niais in falconry," she explained. "A branchier is the young bird, which is just able to leave the nest and hop from branch to branch. A young bird which has not yet molted is called a sor, and a muet is a hawk which has molted in captivity. When we catch a wild falcon which has changed its plumage, we term it a agar. Raoul first taught me to dress a falcon. Shall I teach you how it is done?" She seated herself on the bank of the stream among the falcons, and I threw myself at her feet to listen. Then the Demoiselle 10 held up one rosy-tipped finger and began very gravely. "First, one must catch the falcon." "I am caught," I answered. She laughed very prettily and told me my dressage would perhaps be difficult, as I was noble. "I am already tamed," I replied, "jest and belled." She laughed, delighted. "Oh, my brave falcon, then you will return at my call?" "I am yours," I answered gravely. She sat silent for a moment. Then the colour heightened in her cheeks, and she held up her finger again, saying, "Listen, I wish to speak of falconry." "I listen, Countess Jeanne d'Ys." But again she fell into the reverie, and her eyes seemed fixed on something beyond the summer clouds. "Philip," she said at last. "Jeanne," I whispered. "That is all. That is what I wished," she sighed. "Philip and Jeanne." She held her hand toward me, and I touched it with my lips. "Win me," she said, but this time it was the body and soul which spoke in unison. After a while she began again. "Let us speak of falconry." "Begin," I replied. "We have caught the falcon." Then Jeanne d'Ys took my hand in both of hers, and told me how with infinite patience the young falcon was taught to perch upon the wrist, how little by little it became used to the belled jesses and the chaperon à cornettes. "They must first have a good appetite," she said. "Then, little by little, I reduce their nourishment, which in falconry we call pas. When, after many nights have passed, au bloc, as these birds are now, I prevail upon the agar to stay quietly on the wrist. Then the bird is ready to be taught to come for its food. I fix the pas to the end of a thong or leurre, and teach the bird to come to me as soon as I begin to whirl the cord in circles about my head. At first I drop the pas when the falcon comes, and he eats the food on the ground. After a little he will learn to seize the lure in motion, as I whirl it around my head or drag it over the ground. After this, it is easy to teach the falcon to strike at game, always remembering to faire courtoisie à l'oiseau, that is, to allow the bird to taste the quarry." A squeal from one of the falcons interrupted her, and she arose to adjust the longe which had become whipped around the block, but the bird still flapped its wings and screamed. "What is the matter?" she said. "Philip, can you see?" I looked around, and at first saw nothing to cause the commotion, which was now heightened by the screams and flapping of all the birds. Then my eye fell upon the flat rock beside the stream from which the girl had risen, A grey serpent was moving slowly across the surface of the boulder, and the eyes in its flat, triangular head sparkled like jet. "A couleuvre," she said quietly. "It is harmless, is it not?" I asked. She pointed to the black V-shaped figure on the neck. "It is certain death," she said. "It is a viper." We watched the reptile moving slowly over the smooth rock to where the sunlight fell in a broad, warm patch. I started forward to examine it, but she clung to my arm, crying, "Don't, Philip, I am afraid." "For me?" "For you, Philip. I love you." Then I took her in my arms and kissed her on the lips, but all I could say was, "Jeanne, Jeanne, Jeanne." And as she lay trembling on my breast, something struck my foot in the grass below, but I did not heed it. Then again something struck my ankle, and a sharp pain shot through me. I looked into the sweet face of Jeanne d'Ys and kissed her, and with all my strength lifted her in my arms and flung her from me. Then, bending, I tore the viper from my ankle and set my heel upon its head. I remember feeling weak and numb. I remember falling to the ground. Through my slowly glazing eyes, I saw Jeanne's white face bending close to mine, and when the light in my eyes went out, I still felt her arms about my neck and her soft cheek against my drawn lips. When I opened my eyes, I looked around in terror. Jeanne was gone. I saw the stream and the flat rock. I saw the crushed viper in the grass beside me, but the hawks and blocks had disappeared. I sprang to my feet. The garden, the fruit trees, the drawbridge and the walled court were gone. I stared stupidly at a heap of crumbling ruins, ivy-covered and grey, through which great trees had pushed their way. I crept forward, dragging my numbed foot, and as I moved, a falcon sailed from the treetops among the ruins, and soaring, mounting in narrowing circles, faded and vanished in the clouds above. "Jeanne! Jeanne!" I cried, but my voice died on my lips, and I fell on my knees among the weeds. And as God willed it, I, not knowing, had fallen kneeling before a crumbling shrine carved in stone for our Mother of Sorrows. I saw the sad face of the Virgin wrought in the cold stone. I saw the cross and thorns at her feet, and beneath it I read, "Pray for the soul of the Demoiselle Jeanne d'Ys, who died in her youth for love of Philip, a stranger, A.D. 1573. But upon the icy slab lay a woman's glove, still warm and fragrant." A collection of short pieces from the middle of the work. The Prophet's Paradise. If but the vine and love-abjuring band are in the Prophet's paradise to stand, alack, I doubt the Prophet's paradise were empty as the hollow of one's hand. The Studio. He smiled, saying, "Seek her throughout the world." I said, "Why tell me of the world? My world is here, between these walls and the sheet of glass above, here among gilded flagons and dull jewelled arms, tarnished frames and canvases, black chests and high-backed chairs, quaintly carved and stained in blue and gold." "For whom do you wait?" he said, and I answered, "When she comes I shall know her." On my hearth a tongue of flame whispered secrets to the whitening ashes. In the street below I heard footsteps, a voice, and a song. "For whom then do you wait?" he said, and I answered, "I shall know her." Footsteps, a voice, and a song in the street below, and I knew the song, but neither the steps nor the voice. "Fool!" he cried, "the song is the same. The voice and steps have but changed with years." On the hearth a tongue of flame whispered above the whitening ashes, Wait no more. They have passed. The steps and the voice in the street below. Then he smiled, saying, For whom do you wait? Seeker throughout the world. I answered, My world is here, between these walls and the sheet of glass above. Here among gilded flagons and dull jewelled arms, tarnished frames and canvases, black chests and high-backed chairs, quaintly carved and stained in blue and gold. The phantom of the past would go no further. If it is true, she sighed, that you find in me a friend, let us turn back together. You will forget here under the summer sky. I held her close, pleading, caressing. I seized her, white with anger, but she resisted. If it is true, she sighed, that you find in me a friend, let us turn back together. The phantom of the past would go no further. The sacrifice. I went into a field of flowers, whose petals are whiter than snow, and whose hearts are pure gold. Far afield a woman cried, I have killed him I loved, and from a jar she poured blood upon the flowers whose petals are whiter than snow, and whose hearts are pure gold. Far afield I followed, and on the jar I read 1,000 names, while from within the fresh blood bubbled to the brim. I have killed him I loved, she cried. The world's athirst. Now let it drink. She passed, and far afield I watched her, pouring blood upon the flowers whose petals are whiter than snow, and whose hearts are pure gold. Destiny. I came to the bridge which few may pass. Pass, cried the keeper, but I laughed, saying, There is time, and he smiled and shut the gates. To the bridge which few may pass came young and old. All were refused. Idly I stood and counted them, until, wearied of their noise and lamentations, I came again to the bridge which few may pass. Those in the throng about the gates shrieked out, He comes too late! But I laughed, saying, There is time. Pass, cried the keeper as I entered, then smiled and shut the gates. The throng. There, where the throng was thickest in the street, I stood with Pierrot. All eyes were turned on me. What are they laughing at? I asked, but he grinned, dusting the chalk from my black cloak. I cannot see. It must be something droll, perhaps an honest thief. All eyes were turned on me. He has robbed you of your purse, they laughed. My purse, I cried. Pierrot, help, it is a thief. They laughed. He has robbed you of your purse. Then Truth stepped out, holding a mirror. If he is an honest thief, cried Truth, Pierrot shall find him with this mirror. But he only grinned, dusting the chalk from my black cloak. You see, he said, Truth is an honest thief. She brings you back your mirror. All eyes were turned on me. Arrest Truth, I cried, forgetting it was not a mirror, but a purse I lost, standing with Pierrot, there where the throng was thickest in the street. The jester. Was she fair? I asked, but he only chuckled, listening to the bells jingling on his cap. Stabbed, he tittered. Think of the long journey, the days of peril, the dreadful nights. Think how he wandered for her sake, year after year, through hostile lands, yearning for kith and kin, yearning for her. Stabbed, he tittered, listening to the bells jingling on his cap. Was she fair? I asked, but he only snarled, muttering to the bells jingling on his cap. She kissed him at the gate, he tittered. But in the hall his brother's welcome touched his heart. Was she fair? I asked. Stabbed, he chuckled. Think of the long journey, the days of peril, the dreadful nights. Think how he wandered for her sake, year after year through hostile lands, yearning for kith and kin, yearning for her. She kissed him at the gate, but in the hall his brother's welcome touched his heart. Was she fair? I asked, but he only snarled, listening to the bells jingling in his cap. The green room. The clown turned his powdered face to the mirror. If to be fair is to be beautiful, he said, who can compare with me in my white mask? Who can compare with him in his white mask? I asked of Death beside me. Who can compare with me? Said Death, for I am paler still. You are very beautiful, sighed the clown, turning his powdered face from the mirror. The love test. If it is true that you love, said Love, then wait no longer. Give her these jewels which would dishonour her, and so dishonour you in loving one dishonoured. If it is true that you love, said Love, then wait no longer. I took the jewels and went to her, but she trod upon them, sobbing, Teach me to wait. I love you. Then wait, if it is true, said Love. The Street of the Four Winds. Ferme tes yeux à demi, croise tes bras sur ton sein, et de ton cœur endormi, chasse à jamais tout dessein. Je chante la nature, les étoiles du soir, les larmes du matin, les couchers de soleil à l'horizon lointain, le ciel qui parle au cœur d'existence future. Part 1. The animal paused on the threshold, interrogative, alert, ready for flight if necessary. Seven laid down his palette and held out a hand of welcome. The cat remained motionless, her yellow eyes fastened upon Seven. Puss, he said in his low, pleasant voice, come in. The tip of her thin tail twitched uncertainly. Come in, he said again. Apparently she found his voice reassuring, for she slowly settled upon all fours, her eyes still fastened upon him, her tail tucked under her gaunt flanks. He rose from his easel, smiling. She eyed him quietly, and when he walked toward her, she watched him bend above her without a wince. Her eyes followed his hand until it touched her head. Then she uttered a ragged mew. It had long been Seven's custom to converse with animals, probably because he lived so much alone, and now he said, What's the matter, Puss? Her timid eyes sought his. I understand, he said gently. You shall have it at once. Then, moving quietly about, he busied himself with the duties of a host, rinsed a saucer, filled it with the rest of the milk from the bottle on the window-sill, and, kneeling down, crumbled a roll into the hollow of his hand. The creature rose and crept toward the saucer. With the handle of a palette knife he stirred the crumbs and milk together, and stepped back as she thrust her nose into the mess. He watched her in silence. From time to time the saucer clinked upon the tiled floor as she reached for a morsel on the rim, and at last the bread was all gone, and her purple tongue travelled over every unlicked spot until the saucer shone like polished marble. Then she sat up, and, coolly turning her back to him, began her ablutions. Keep it up, said Seven, much interested. You need it. She flattened one ear, but neither turned nor interrupted her toilet. As the grime was slowly removed, Seven observed that nature had intended her for a white cat. Her fur had disappeared in patches, from disease or the chances of war. Her tail was bony and her spine sharp. But what charms she had were becoming apparent under vigorous licking, and he waited until she had finished before reopening the conversation. When at last she closed her eyes and folded her forepaws under her breast, he began again, very gently. "Puss, tell me your troubles." At the sound of his voice, she broke into a harsh rumbling, which he recognized as an attempt to purr. He bent over to rub her cheek, and she mewed again, an amiable, inquiring little mew, to which he replied, "Certainly you're greatly improved, and when you recover your plumage you will be a gorgeous bird." Much flattered, she stood up and marched around and around his legs, pushing her head between them and making pleased remarks, to which he responded with grave politeness. "Now what sent you here?" he said. "Here into the street of the Four Winds, and up 5 flights to the very door where you would be welcome. What was it that prevented your meditated flight when I turned from my canvas to encounter your yellow eyes? Are you a Latin Quarter cat, as I am a Latin Quarter man? And why do you wear a rose-coloured flowered garter buckled around your neck?" The cat had climbed into his lap, and now sat purring as he passed his hand over her thin coat. "Excuse me," he continued in lazy, soothing tones, harmonizing with her purring, "if I seem indelicate, but I cannot help musing on this rose-coloured garter, flowered so quaintly, and fastened with a silver clasp. For the clasp is silver. I can see the mint mark on the edge, as is prescribed by the law of the French Republic. Now, why is this garter, woven of rose silk and delicately embroidered, why is this silken garter with its silver clasp about your famished throat? Am I indiscreet when I inquire if its owner is your owner? Is she some aged dame living in memory of youthful vanities, fond, doting on you, decorating you with her intimate personal attire? The circumference of the garter would suggest this, for your neck is thin, and the garter fits you. But then again I notice most things, that the garter is capable of being much enlarged. These small silver-rimmed eyelets, of which I count 5, are proof of that. And now I observe that the 5th eyelet is worn out, as though the tongue of the clasp were accustomed to lie there. That seems to argue a well-rounded form." The cat curled her toes in contentment. The street was very still outside. He murmured on, "Why should your mistress decorate you with an article most necessary to her at all times? Well, anyway, at most times. How did she come to slip this bit of silk and silver about your neck? Was it the caprice of a moment, when you, before you had lost your pristine plumpness, marched singing into her bedroom to bid her good morning? Of course, and she sat up among the pillows, her coiled hair tumbling to her shoulders, as you sprang upon the bed, purring, 'Good day, my lady.' Oh, it is very easy to understand," he yawned, resting his head upon the back of the chair. The cat still purred, tightening and relaxing her padded claws over his knee. "Shall I tell you all about her, cat? She is very beautiful, your mistress," he murmured drowsily, "and her hair is heavy as burnished gold. I could paint her, not on canvas, for I should need shades and tones, and hues and dyes more splendid than the iris of a splendid rainbow. I could only paint her with closed eyes, for in dreams alone can such colours as I need be found. For her eyes I must have azure from skies untroubled by a cloud, the skies of dreamland. For her lips, roses from the palaces of slumberland, and for her brow, snowdrifts from mountains which tower in fantastic pinnacles to the moons. Oh, much higher than our moon here. The crystal moons of dreamland. She is very beautiful, your mistress." The words died on his lips, and his eyelids drooped. The cat, too, was asleep, her cheek turned up upon her wasted flank, her paws relaxed and limp. Part 2. "It is fortunate," said Seven, sitting up and stretching, "that we have tided over the dinner hour, for I have nothing to offer you for supper but what may be purchased with 1 silver franc." The cat on his knee rose, arched her back, yawned, and looked up at him. "What shall it be? A roast chicken with salad? No? Possibly you prefer beef? Of course. And I shall try an egg and some white bread. Now for the wines. Milk for you? Good. I shall take a little water, fresh from the wood," with a motion towards the bucket in the sink. He put on his hat and left the room. The cat followed to the door, and after he had closed it behind him, she settled down, smelling at the cracks and cocking one ear at every creak from the crazy old building. The door below opened and shut. The cat looked serious for a moment, doubtful, and her ears flattened in nervous expectation. Presently she rose with a jerk of her tail, and started on a noiseless tour of the studio. She sneezed at a pot of turpentine, hastily retreating to the table, which she presently mounted, and having satisfied her curiosity concerning a roll of red modelling wax, returned to the door, and sat down with her eyes on the crack over the threshold. Then she lifted her voice in a thin plaint. When Seven returned, he looked grave, but the cat, joyous and demonstrative, marched around him, rubbing her gaunt body against his legs, driving her head enthusiastically into his hand, and purring until her voice mounted to a squeal. He placed a bit of meat, wrapped in brown paper, upon the table, and with a penknife cut it into shreds. The milk he took from a bottle which had served for medicine, and poured it into the saucer on the hearth. The cat crouched before it, purring and lapping at the same time. He cooked his egg and ate it with a slice of bread, watching her busy with the shredded meat, and when he had finished, and had filled and emptied a cup of water from the bucket in the sink, he sat down, taking her into his lap, where she at once curled up and began her toilet. He began to speak again, touching her caressingly at times, by way of emphasis. "Cat, I have found out where your mistress lives. It is not very far away. It is here, under this same leaky roof, but in the north wing, which I had supposed was uninhabited. My janitor tells me this. By chance he is almost sober this evening. The butcher on the Rue de Seine, where I bought your meat, knows you, and old Caban, the baker, identified you with needless sarcasm. They tell me hard tales of your mistress, which I shall not believe. They say she is idle and vain and pleasure-loving. They say she is hare-brained and reckless. The little sculptor on the ground floor, who was buying rolls from old Caban, spoke to me tonight for the first time, although we have always bowed to each other. He said she was very good and very beautiful. He has only seen her once, and does not know her name. I thanked him. I don't know why I thanked him so warmly. Caban said, 'Into this cursed street of the four winds blow all things evil.' The sculptor looked confused, but when he went out with his rolls, he said to me, 'I am sure, monsieur, that she is as good as she is beautiful.' The cat had finished her toilet, and now, springing softly to the floor, went to the door and sniffed. He knelt beside her, and unclasping the garter, held it for a moment in his hands. After a while he said, 'There is a name engraved upon the clasp, beneath the silver buckle. It is a pretty name, Sylvia Elven. Sylvia is a woman's name. Elven is the name of a town. In Paris, in this quarter, above all in this street of the four winds, names are worn and put away as the fashions change with the seasons. I know the little town of Elvin, for there I met Fate face to face, and Fate was unkind. But do you know that in Elvin Fate had another name, and that name was Sylvia? He replaced the garter and stood up, looking down at the cat crouched before the closed door. The name of Elvin has a charm for me. It tells me of meadows and clear rivers. The name of Sylvia troubles me like perfume from dead flowers. The cat mewed. Yes, yes, he said soothingly, I will take you back. Your Sylvia is not my Sylvia. The world is wide, and Elvin is not unknown. Yet in the darkness and filth of poorer Paris, in the sad shadows of this ancient house, these names are very pleasant to me. He lifted her in his arms and strode through the silent corridors to the stairs, down 5 flights and into the moonlit court, past the little sculptor's den, and then again in at the gate of the north wing and up the worm-eaten stairs he passed, until he came to a closed door. When he had stood knocking for a long time, something moved behind the door. It opened, and he went in. The room was dark. As he crossed the threshold, the cat sprang from his arms into the shadows. He listened, but heard nothing. The silence was oppressive, and he struck a match. At his elbow stood a table, and on the table a candle in a gilded candlestick. This he lighted, then looked around. The chamber was vast, the hangings heavy with embroidery. Over the fireplace towered a carved mantel, grey with the ashes of dead fires. In a recess by the deep-set windows stood a bed, from which the bedclothes, soft and fine as lace, trailed to the polished floor. He lifted the candle above his head. A handkerchief lay at his feet. It was faintly perfumed. He turned toward the windows. In front of them was a canapé, and over it were flung pell-mell a gown of silk, a heap of lace-like garments, white and delicate as spiders' meshes, long crumpled gloves, and on the floor beneath the stockings, the little pointed shoes, and one garter of rosy silk, quaintly flowered and fitted with a silver clasp. Wondering, he stepped forward and drew the heavy curtains from the bed. For a moment the candle flared in his hand. Then his eyes met 2 other eyes, wide open, smiling, and the candle flame flashed over hair heavy as gold. She was pale, but not as white as he. Her eyes were untroubled as a child's, but he stared, trembling from head to foot, while the candle flickered in his hand. At last he whispered, "Sylvia, it is I." Again he said, "It is I." Then, knowing that she was dead, he kissed her on the mouth. And through the long watches of the night, the cat purred on his knee, tightening and relaxing her padded claws, until the sky paled above the street of the four winds. The End of The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers.
Thank you for listening to The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Join us next time when we have a full episode. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and at pgttcm.com and pgttcm.podbean.com. People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos is part of the Dark Myths Collective. Check out darkmyths.org to find out more about them and some really cool podcasts. This episode has been edited by DB Spitzer. Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You've been listening to The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos, PGTTCM.com. Ooh, stay squiggly, keep it weird, or stay weird and keep it squiggly. Whichever you want to do, you do it.